I've been a U.S. Forest Ranger for 18 years, and in all that time, I've seen my fair share of weird stuff. Drifters setting up illegal camps, teenagers on acid wandering around like zombies, even a bear that somehow managed to get into someone's Subaru and honk the horn until help arrived. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened last October in Black Hollow Forest. Black Hollow isn't your average stretch of woodland. It's dense, almost unnaturally so, and the locals won't go near it unless they have to. They say the trees whisper at night. That sounds like backwoods superstition, right? That's what I thought too, until I didn't. It started with a missing hiker, a 22-year-old college kid named Alan Carter. His parents called the station, frantic. He hadn't checked in for 2 days, and his last known location was deep in Black Hollow, near a section of the forest we call Dead Man's Loop. I radioed in for backup, but everyone was tied up with a wildfire about 60 miles north. So, lucky me, I got to play hero. I grabbed my gear, compass, flashlight, flare gun, and headed into the woods. The first thing you notice about Black Hollow is the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It's like the place is holding its breath. After about an hour of hiking, I found Alan's campsite. His tent was still standing, his gear untouched, but no sign of him. That's when I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling, "Help me." I froze. It sounded like Alan, but it was coming from deeper in the woods, in the direction of Dead Man's Loop. I called out, "Alan, stay where you are. I'm coming." The voice didn't answer. I followed the sound, my boots crunching on the dead leaves. The deeper I went, the darker it got. It wasn't even sunset yet, but the canopy above was so thick it blocked out the light. The voice called out again, closer this time. "Help me." But there was something off about it. It was flat, like someone mimicking Alan's voice but missing the emotion. I kept going, my gut screaming at me to turn around. Then I saw it, a figure standing in a small clearing. It looked like Alan. Same brown jacket, same curly hair. "Alan?" I called. The figure turned and my stomach dropped. Its face wasn't right. The eyes were too large, the mouth stretched into a grin that didn't belong on a human face. And it wasn't standing. It was hovering, just a few inches off the ground. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The thing tilted its head, like a dog hearing a strange noise, and then it spoke. "Help me," it said again, but this time the voice was a mix of sounds. A child crying, a woman screaming, static from an old radio. I bolted. I don't remember much of the run back. Branches clawed at my face, roots grabbed at my boots, and the thing's voice followed me the entire way. "Help me. Don't leave. We know your name." By the time I made it back to my truck, I was shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition. I radioed in the incident, but I left out the part about the floating figure. I said I heard Alan's voice but couldn't find him. They never did find him. The search was called off after 2 weeks and his parents eventually moved away. But here's the thing. I know Alan's still out there. Every so often when I'm working late at the station, I'll hear it. His voice, faint and distant, calling from the woods. "Help me." And sometimes, when the wind dies down and the forest goes still, I swear I can hear something else. The trees, whispering my name. I've been stationed at Ridgewood National Park for 10 years now. I signed up for the quiet life. Just me, the forest, and the occasional hiker needing directions. I didn't expect excitement, and I was fine with that. But in all my years of service, there's one night I can't shake, one that keeps me awake even now. It happened last spring. I was assigned to Tower 7, the oldest and most remote fire watchtower in the park. It's perched high on Blue Elk Ridge, miles from the main station. You can see for miles up there, nothing but trees and mountains, with the nearest road a good 2 hours hike away. The shift started normal enough. The sun was setting, painting the sky in reds and oranges. I'd just settled in with a thermos of coffee and a dog-eared copy of Pet Sematary. Ironic, I know, when the radio crackled to life. "Tower 7, come in." I grabbed the handset. "This is Tower 7. Go ahead." There was static for a moment, then a voice I didn't recognize. It was faint, almost like a whisper. "Is anyone there? Please help." My first thought was a lost hiker. It wasn't unusual for someone to stray off the marked trails, thinking they could find a shortcut. I tried to get more information. "Copy that. Can you tell me your location?" Nothing but static. "Do you have a light, a flare, anything I can use to find you?" And then, clear as day, "I'm at the tower. Please come down." I froze. That didn't make any sense. I was at the tower, and no one else was there. I grabbed my flashlight and leaned over the railing, shining it down. The beam swept across the clearing below. Nothing. "Listen," I said into the radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm at the tower and I don't see you. Can you give me a landmark? Something nearby?" The voice didn't answer. An hour passed. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No owls, no crickets, nothing. Just the wind pushing through the trees. I was starting to convince myself it was some kind of prank when I heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, coming up one step at a time. "Hello?" I called out, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps didn't stop. I pointed the beam at the trapdoor leading up to the tower. It was closed, but the sound of the steps kept coming, echoing as if they were just below me. "Stop right there," I shouted. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, everything was still. Then the trapdoor rattled like someone was trying to push it open. I backed away, heart hammering. "Who's there?" I demanded. A voice drifted up through the floorboards, soft and breathy, the same voice from the radio. "Let me in. It's so cold out here." I didn't move. My flashlight started flickering, casting strange shadows on the walls. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in. You left me out here." "I don't know who you are," I shouted, though my voice cracked. "Go away or I'll call for backup." That's when the voice changed. It wasn't pleading anymore. It was mocking. "You already know me, Ranger," it hissed. "Don't you remember?" Suddenly, the rattling stopped. The footsteps receded, slower this time, fading into silence. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the flashlight trained on the trapdoor until the first light of dawn broke over the ridge. When I finally summoned the courage to climb down, I found something waiting for me at the base of the tower, a pair of boots. They were old and scuffed, caked with dried mud. But here's the thing. They were the exact same boots I was wearing. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I heard. And sometimes, when I'm out on patrol late at night, I hear those footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, coming closer, and every time I wonder if they're coming for me. When people ask me why I left my job as a forest ranger, I usually give them a polite lie. Family reasons, I'll say, or I wanted a change. What I never tell them is the truth, that I left because of what I saw, or more accurately, what saw me. It was my third year working in Shale Valley National Park, a sprawling patch of wilderness in Colorado. Beautiful place, towering pines, crystal clear streams, the kind of landscape that makes you feel small in the best way. That feeling of peace shattered one cold night in December. I was on night patrol, checking campsites and logging any signs of wildlife. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than usual. I had my flashlight, my radio, and my old Jeep parked a mile back on the trail. Around 11 p.m., I came across a ravine I'd never noticed before. It wasn't on any of the maps, and I thought I knew this park like the back of my hand. But there it was, a steep drop, maybe 30 feet down, with jagged rocks and gnarled tree roots jutting out like claws. Something about it felt wrong. The air was colder there, and the trees leaned in, their branches knotted together like they were whispering secrets. Then I saw it. At the bottom of the ravine, there was a light, a faint bluish glow like a lantern. I should have called it in. I know that now. But curiosity got the better of me. I figured maybe it was a lost camper, someone who had wandered too far off the trail. I started down the slope, moving carefully so I wouldn't lose my footing. The closer I got, the more I realized the light wasn't a lantern. It didn't flicker like a flame. It pulsed, almost like it was alive. By the time I reached the bottom, the glow was gone. In its place was something else, a smell. It was sharp and metallic, like blood. But there was something underneath it, something worse. Rot, decay. I shined my flashlight around, the beam slicing through the dark. That's when I saw the bones. They were scattered across the ground, half buried in the dirt. Not animal bones, human. Some of them looked fresh, the marrow still wet and glistening. Others were old, brittle, splintered, like someone had tried to chew them. I turned to head back up the slope, my heart pounding. But then I heard it, a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. It was a voice, soft and raspy, coming from the shadows. "Help me." I froze. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, don't leave me." My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought the batteries were dying. Then I realized it wasn't the light. It was the darkness. It was moving. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. Something tall and thin, its body impossibly contorted. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed with that same eerie blue light. It took a step toward me, and the ground beneath its feet seemed to wither, the grass turning black and brittle. "Stay back," I shouted, pulling the flare gun from my belt. The thing tilted its head, studying me like I was an insect pinned to a board. Then it smiled, revealing a mouth full of too many teeth. "You're not supposed to be here," it said, its voice like 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other. I fired the flare, the red light blazing through the darkness. The thing shrieked, a sound so loud and piercing it felt like knives stabbing into my ears. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, scrambling up the slope, my hands bleeding from grabbing at the jagged rocks. When I reached the top, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I reached the Jeep, jumped in, and sped back to the station. I reported a bear sighting, but I think my supervisor knew I was lying. He didn't push, though. Maybe he'd seen something too. I quit the next day. Now, I live 3 states away, and I avoid forests like the plague. But sometimes late at night I'll wake up and feel like I'm being watched. I'll look out the window, and for just a second I'll see a faint blue light in the distance. The thing in the ravine hasn't forgotten me, and I don't think it ever will. When you work as a forest ranger, you get used to the quiet. It's a different kind of quiet out here. No cars, no hum of electricity, just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of animals. For some people, that silence is peaceful. For me, after what happened, it's a reminder of how wrong the woods can feel when something out there is watching you. This was about 5 years ago, back when I was stationed at Clearwater National Forest in Idaho. It was late October, the kind of chilly where your breath hangs in the air like a ghost. I was on the night shift, alone in the ranger station. Around midnight, the radio crackled to life. "Clearwater Station, come in." I grabbed the mic. "This is Clearwater, go ahead." At first, there was just static. Then I heard it, a low, raspy voice. "Help me." My stomach dropped. It didn't sound like the usual hiker in trouble. The voice was strained, like whoever was speaking had been screaming for hours. "Where are you?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. The response was a whisper, barely audible over the static. "By the old cabin. It's coming back." The old cabin. I knew exactly where that was. An abandoned hunting lodge about 5 miles from the station. The place had been off limits for years, partly because it was falling apart and partly because of the stories. I should have called for backup. But the thing is, there was no backup. I was the only ranger on duty that night, and the nearest help was a good hour away. So I grabbed my flashlight, my radio, and my sidearm, and I headed out. The trail to the cabin was overgrown, the kind of path that looks like it hasn't been used in decades. The woods felt different that night, heavier, like the trees were leaning in just a little too close. About halfway there, I stopped. Something didn't feel right. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't behind me or ahead of me. They were off to the side, moving parallel to the trail. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. The crunch of leaves and snapping of twigs was deliberate, like they wanted me to know they were there. "Hello?" I called out, my flashlight sweeping through the trees. Nothing. I picked up the pace, practically jogging by the time the cabin came into view. It looked worse than I remembered. Half the roof had caved in, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. The footsteps had stopped. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my boots. "Hello? This is the Park Service. I'm here to help." The air inside was freezing, colder than it had any right to be. My breath clouded in front of me as I scanned the room. That's when I saw it. A man crouched in the corner, his back to me. His clothes were torn and his skin was pale, almost gray. He was shaking, muttering something I couldn't make out. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked, keeping my distance. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, and that's when he stopped shaking. Slowly, he turned his head to look at me. His eyes were black, not dark, not bloodshot, just black, like staring into two bottomless pits. "Get out," he hissed, his voice layered, like more than one person was speaking at once. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "What's going on here? Who are you?" He stood up, impossibly fast, and for a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at me. But instead, he pointed toward the door. "It's here." The cabin filled with a sound I'll never forget. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. That's when I saw it, a shape moving just outside the broken window. It was massive, hunched over, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to drag along the ground. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. And it was watching me. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted out of the cabin, crashing through the underbrush, the thing's footsteps pounding behind me. They were heavy, shaking the ground with each step. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the station, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The radio crackled again. "Help me," the voice said, but this time, it wasn't raspy. It was mine. I quit 2 days later. Told my supervisor I needed a fresh start. I don't go into the woods anymore. I moved to a city, surrounded by concrete and streetlights. But every now and then, I'll hear a noise outside my apartment, a faint growl, or the sound of footsteps in the alley, and I'll remember those eyes watching me from the dark. Being a forest ranger in northern Wyoming is mostly quiet work. Long hours of solitude, occasional campfires to extinguish, and the odd call to rescue a hiker who wandered too far off the beaten path. I liked it that way. At least, I thought I did. Then came the night on Shadow Ridge. Shadow Ridge is one of those places that makes your skin crawl for no good reason. Maybe it's the way the wind howls through the pines, or the stories the locals tell about strange lights and lost hunters. Either way, I avoided it when I could. But on that night, I didn't have a choice. It was late September, just before the first snow, and the moon was full enough to light the trails. A call came in around 10 p.m. A pair of hikers hadn't returned to their campsite near the ridge. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, radio, rifle, then set off in the Jeep. The drive took me to the base of the trailhead, and from there, I hiked. It was cold, the kind of cold that bites at your face and makes you pull your collar higher. About an hour in, I found their campsite. The fire was out, just embers glowing faintly in the dark. Their tent was still up, but it was empty. What struck me, though, were the tracks. There were 2 sets of footprints heading toward the ridge. But there was something else, too. Something bigger. The tracks were odd, almost canine, but much larger, like a wolf that had been stretched out and made wrong. They followed the hiker's trail, weaving in and out, sometimes on all fours, sometimes not. I radioed it in. "Base, this is Ranger Scott. I'm at the hiker's campsite. Looks like they went toward Shadow Ridge, found some unusual tracks." The response crackled through. "Copy that. Be careful, Scott. Shadow Ridge has been quiet for years, but we've had reports." They didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I kept moving, following the tracks. The forest felt alive in the worst way. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. The wind carried strange sounds, low growls and sharp cries that didn't belong to any animal I knew. Then I found them, or what was left of them. The hikers were lying in a small clearing, their bodies twisted and broken, as if something had slammed them into the ground over and over again. Their faces were frozen in terror, their mouths open in silent screams. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before the growl came again. It wasn't distant this time. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the trees. That's when I saw it. It was standing on the ridge, silhouetted against the moonlight. Tall, too tall to be a wolf or a bear. Its limbs were long and thin, its back hunched, its head low. Its eyes glowed yellow, reflecting the light like polished glass. And then it howled. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard. It was deep and guttural, filled with rage and hunger. But there was something else in it, something almost human. I raised my rifle, my hand shaking. "Stay back!" I shouted. The thing tilted its head as if considering me. Then it dropped to all fours and started moving. It was fast, faster than anything that size should be. I fired, the shot echoing through the forest, but it didn't slow down. I ran. The trail was steep, my boots slipping on loose rocks and damp leaves. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, its breath hot and wet on the back of my neck. When I reached the Jeep, I didn't even bother to look back. I threw myself inside, started the engine, and slammed on the gas. The thing followed, keeping pace with the vehicle, its claws scraping against the metal as it tried to climb onto the roof. I swerved, the Jeep bouncing over rocks and roots until I hit a clearing where the moonlight poured down like a spotlight. The creature stopped, retreating into the shadows as if the light burned it, and then it was gone. I reported the hikers as victims of a bear attack. That's the story the officials went with. People don't ask too many questions about bear attacks out here. They're common enough. But I know what I saw. I've since transferred to a different park, far away from Shadow Ridge. But sometimes on quiet nights I hear that howl in my dreams and I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced it's outside my window. I don't know what it was. Maybe I don't want to know. But I'll tell you this much. If you ever find yourself near Shadow Ridge and the wind starts to howl, don't stop, don't look back, and whatever you do, don't follow the tracks. I've been a forest ranger in the Pacific Northwest for 15 years. In that time, I've seen my share of strange things. A bear standing on its hind legs like a man, trees split clean in half by lightning, and once, a hiker who swore he saw a UFO. But none of that comes close to what happened on Devil's Crest. That's what the locals call it, Devil's Crest. The real name is Pine Hollow Ridge, but I guess that didn't have the same ring to it. The stories about the place go back generations. Hunters disappearing, strange lights at night, whispers in the trees. Most of it's just talk, or at least that's what I used to think. It started with a call late one October night. A camper, a young guy named Danny, had gone missing. He was part of a group camping near the base of the ridge, but when his friends woke up, his sleeping bag was empty, and he was nowhere to be found. By the time I reached the site, it was just past midnight. The campfire was still smoldering, and his friends, 3 of them, were huddled together, pale and wide-eyed. "Did he say where he was going?" I asked, shining my flashlight around the clearing. One of them, a girl with long blonde hair, shook her head. "No. We all went to sleep, and when we woke up, he was gone. But we heard something." "What kind of something?" She hesitated. "It sounded like whistling, coming from the ridge." I didn't like that. Whistling in the woods at night. It never means anything good. I told them to stay put, then started up the trail alone. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, owls, were absent. About a mile in, I found the first sign of him. A shoe, lying in the middle of the path. "Danny?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. No response. I kept going, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees around me, they were marked, not scratches, like you'd see from a bear or a cougar, but carvings, symbols, spirals, triangles, things I didn't recognize. They were crude but deliberate, etched deep into the bark. And then I heard it. Whistling. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it grew louder as I climbed higher. It wasn't a tune exactly, just a high, wavering note that set my teeth on edge. I reached a clearing near the top of the ridge, and that's when I saw him. Danny was standing at the edge, staring out into the abyss. His back was to me, and his body was unnaturally still. "Danny," I called out, but he didn't move. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the frosty ground. "Hey kid, your friends are worried about you. Let's get you back to camp." When I touched his shoulder, he turned around, and my blood ran cold. His eyes, they were black, completely black, like twin voids. And his face, it didn't look like a face anymore. The features were stretched, warped, as if something had pressed its hands into wet clay. He smiled then, a slow, horrible smile that didn't belong on a human face. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and distorted. I stumbled back, my hand reaching for the radio on my belt. "Danny, what the hell is going on?" He laughed, a sound that didn't match the silence around us. Then he pointed past me toward the trees. I turned, and that's when I saw it. Something was moving between the pines, tall and thin, its body blending into the shadows. It had limbs too long, a head that tilted unnaturally, and eyes that glowed faintly, like embers. The whistling grew louder, almost deafening now, and I realized it wasn't coming from Danny. It was coming from it. I didn't think. I grabbed Danny by the arm and started dragging him back down the trail. His body felt wrong, too light, like I was pulling an empty shell. The thing followed us, its footsteps impossibly quiet. Every time I looked back, it was closer, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. When we finally reached the camp, I shoved Danny toward his friends and yelled for them to get in the Jeep. The thing stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching us as we piled into the vehicle. Its head tilted again, almost curious, and then it disappeared into the shadows. We found Danny's body the next morning, at the base of the ridge. He'd been dead for hours, his face frozen in a look of pure terror. The kid we brought back to camp, he was gone. I don't go near Devil's Crest anymore. Hell, I don't even say the name out loud. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whistling, and I know it's still out there waiting. Being a forest ranger in the Appalachian Mountains has its perks. Endless views, fresh air, and the kind of peace that city folks only dream of. But peace has its price. Out here, it's easy to believe you're the only one for miles. That's a comforting thought, right up until the moment you realize you're wrong. This happened 3 years ago, late October. The leaves were in full blaze, reds, oranges, and yellows lighting up the trails. I was working the night shift, patrolling a remote area known as Hollow Bend. Locals had plenty of stories about Hollow Bend. They'd whisper about strange lights in the woods, about shadows that moved where they shouldn't. But the one story they told over and over was about the Lantern Man. The legend goes like this. Decades ago, there was a miner who worked the caves near the ridge. One night, his lantern went out while he was deep underground, and he never found his way back. Now, they say he roams the woods, carrying his lantern, looking for a way out. I didn't believe it. Not then. That night started like any other. The air was cold, crisp, and the moon was just a sliver in the sky. I was doing my usual rounds when I got a call on the radio. "Ranger Scott, we've got reports of a light moving in Hollow Bend. Could be a lost camper." "Copy that," I said, grabbing my flashlight. I drove as far as the Jeep could take me, then started up the trail on foot. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. About 20 minutes in, I saw it. A light, faint and flickering, like an old oil lantern weaving through the trees. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight toward it. "Ranger Scott, are you lost?" The light paused, hovering for a moment, then started moving again, deeper into the woods. I followed it, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The light stayed just far enough ahead to keep me chasing it. Every time I thought I was close, it slipped away, like it was playing a game. "Hey!" I yelled. "Stop right there!" That's when I realized something strange. There were no footsteps, no sound of movement, just the rustling of leaves under my own feet. And then the light disappeared. I stopped, turning in a slow circle, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. All right, enough of this. If you're out here, come on out. The silence that followed was so deep it made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, a faint voice, barely above a whisper. Help me. It came from the trees ahead, soft and desperate. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave, but I didn't. I couldn't. I took a step forward. Where are you? The voice came again, closer this time. Please, help me. I pushed through the underbrush and stumbled into a clearing. At the center was an old mining lantern sitting on the ground, its flame flickering weakly. I knelt down, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The lantern looked ancient. Its metal rusted, its glass cracked. When I reached out to touch it, the flame flared bright, blinding me for a moment. And that's when I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the trees, their gnarled branches twisting in the windless air. Then the light returned, but it wasn't the lantern this time. It was floating, hovering just above the ground. And behind it, a figure began to take shape. It was tall, impossibly thin, its body cloaked in shadows. In one hand, it held a lantern identical to the one at my feet. Its face, or what should have been a face, was nothing but darkness. It raised the lantern, and the flame inside burned brighter, casting the clearing in an eerie golden glow. The voice came again, but this time it was all around me, echoing through the trees. Stay with me. I don't remember much after that. I must have run, though I don't recall making the decision. My legs carried me back to the Jeep, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally made it to the station, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. My supervisor chalked it up to exhaustion, told me to take a couple days off, but I know what I saw. Since that night, I've avoided Hollow Bend. They assigned another ranger to patrol that area, and I didn't argue. Every now and then, we still get reports about lights in the woods, about campers hearing voices late at night. And every time, I wonder if the Lantern Man is still out there, wandering the forest, looking for someone to keep him company. If you ever find yourself near Hollow Bend, do yourself a favor. If you see a light in the woods, don't follow it, because once the Lantern Man finds you, he doesn't let go. They always tell you the forest has a rhythm, a kind of pulse you can feel if you stand still long enough. 15 years as a forest ranger, and I've come to believe that's true. But not all rhythms are natural, and some things in the forest don't want to be found. This story happened about 6 years ago in the remote wilderness of Montana. There's a section of the forest called Black Elk Basin, wild, untouched, and nearly impossible to navigate. Locals avoided it, and I never really pressed them on why. I figured it was just the usual. Ghost stories, superstition, the kind of tales people pass down to keep kids from wandering too far. But then we got the call. A hiker had gone missing, a woman named Grace. She'd been camping near the basin with her boyfriend, Ryan. According to him, she'd gone to gather firewood and never came back. When I arrived at their campsite, Ryan looked like he'd aged 10 years in a single night. His eyes were bloodshot and his hands shook as he spoke. She was just gone, he said, his voice cracking. But I heard her. I heard her calling for me. I frowned. You heard her? What did she say? She was crying, he whispered. She kept saying, "Help me, Ryan, please." But the sound, it didn't come from where she went. It came from everywhere. We started the search immediately. By we, I mean myself and a couple of other rangers. The terrain was brutal, steep cliffs, dense undergrowth, and an unsettling quiet that hung in the air like a fog. About an hour in, we found Grace's footprints. They led us deeper into the basin, toward a rock formation locals called Devil's Maw. Devil's Maw is an enormous cave, hidden behind a thicket of trees and moss-covered boulders. I'd only been there once before, during training, and even then I didn't like it. The air felt heavier, colder, and there was this faint hum, like a distant machine. That's where her tracks ended. Standing at the mouth of the cave, I called out, "Grace, are you in there?" No answer, just the hum, a low, steady vibration that I could feel in my teeth. One of the other rangers, Dave, muttered, "This place gives me the creeps. Feels wrong." I couldn't argue with that. Still, we had a job to do. We split up. Dave and I went into the cave while the third ranger, Maggie, stayed outside to keep watch. The second we stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Our breath fogged the air and the hum grew louder, almost like it was alive. "Grace!" I shouted again, my voice echoing off the damp walls. That's when we heard it. It was a wail, high and piercing, like a woman crying out in pain. It came from deep within the cave, bouncing off the walls until it felt like it was coming from every direction. "Did you hear that?" Dave asked, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Yeah," I said, my heart pounding. We followed the sound, our boots crunching on the gravelly floor. The deeper we went, the worse the air smelled, damp, earthy, with an undercurrent of something rotten. And then we saw it. At first, I thought it was Grace. A figure crouched near the far wall, her back to us. "Grace!" I called out, relief flooding through me. "We're here to help." She didn't move. We approached slowly, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Grace, it's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. When we were about 10 feet away, she turned around. It wasn't Grace. The thing before us looked human, mostly, but its eyes were too large, too dark, and its mouth stretched wider than any mouth should. It smiled, and I saw rows of teeth, sharp and jagged, like a predator's. The wail came again, but this time it wasn't from the figure. It was from deeper in the cave. "Run," Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted back toward the entrance, the sound of footsteps, no, something heavier, pounding behind us. The hum turned into a roar, and the walls of the cave seemed to vibrate. When we burst out into the daylight, Maggie was gone. Her radio lay on the ground, cracked and silent. I wanted to go back for her. God help me, I did. But that sound, that awful, unearthly wail, it stopped me. We reported everything. Grace's disappearance, Maggie's vanishing, the thing we saw in the cave. The official story was that they were lost to the wilderness. That's what we told their families, what we told the press. But I know the truth. Every now and then, I dream about the cave. In my dreams, I hear the wail, echoing through the forest. And sometimes, if I listen closely, I can hear voices calling my name. I haven't been back to Black Elk Basin since that day. And if you're ever hiking near those woods and you hear crying, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. There's a kind of silence in the forest that doesn't feel right. Not peaceful, not serene, just wrong. It's the kind that makes your skin prickle and your gut tighten, like the woods are holding their breath, waiting for something. I've been a forest ranger for over a decade, stationed at Big Rock National Park in Colorado. I've seen my share of odd things, strange lights in the sky, hikers claiming to see ghosts, even a guy swearing he met Bigfoot. Most of the time, it's just stories. But one night I saw something I still can't explain. It was mid-October, the time of year when the park gets quieter. The tourists leave, the animals prepare for winter, and the nights grow long and cold. I was working the late shift, patrolling a stretch of trail near a remote section of the park we call Devil's Hollow. Locals have their superstitions about Devil's Hollow. They say it's cursed, that people who wander too far off the trail don't come back the same, or don't come back at all. I never put much stock in it. A forest is just a forest, right? That night started uneventfully enough. The air was crisp, the moon bright, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional hoot of an owl. Around midnight, I got a call on my radio. "Ranger Parker, you copy?" "Go ahead," I said. "We've got a report of a light moving through Devil's Hollow. Could be a lost hiker. Can you check it out?" I sighed. "Copy that. Heading there now." It wasn't uncommon for hikers to get turned around, especially at night. Most of the time, it was someone who'd underestimated how fast the sun sets out here. I made my way down the trail, my flashlight cutting through the dark. As I got closer to the hollow, the air grew colder, sharper, like stepping into a freezer. My breath fogged in front of me, and the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, wind, distant rustles, faded into an eerie stillness. That's when I saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees, about 50 yards ahead. "Hello?" I called out. "Park Ranger, are you lost?" The light didn't respond. It just kept moving, weaving slowly between the trees. I followed it, my boots crunching on the frosty ground. As I got closer, I realized the light wasn't steady. It pulsed like an old lantern swinging in someone's hand. "Hey!" I shouted. "Stop! I'm here to help." The light paused, hovering for a moment, then darted deeper into the woods. I don't know why, but something about the way it moved made my stomach churn. It wasn't natural. I should have turned back. I know that now, but I didn't. I pushed forward, the light always staying just out of reach. It led me off the trail, into the dense underbrush where the trees grew so close together, they felt like walls. That's when I noticed the smell, earthy and metallic, like wet dirt mixed with rust. It got stronger the deeper I went until it was almost overwhelming. The light stopped ahead, hovering in a small clearing. I stepped into the open space, my flashlight sweeping across the ground, and that's when I saw them. Bones. They were scattered across the clearing, half buried in the dirt. Some were animal, deer maybe, but others looked human. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I raised my radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Parker. I found..." Before I could finish, the radio crackled with static, loud and sharp, and then I heard a voice. Not a normal voice. It was distorted, like a recording played backward, but I could still make out the words. "Turn. Back." I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Who is this?" I demanded, spinning in a slow circle. The forest was still, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. Then the light blinked out, plunging the clearing into darkness. That's when I saw them, eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the shadows between the trees. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew, and they didn't move like animals either. They just stared. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing dimmer, as if the darkness was swallowing it. I backed away, my boots crunching on the bones. The radio crackled again, and the distorted voice returned, louder this time. "Leave. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that clearing. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at my jacket and face. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close. When I finally broke through the tree line and onto the main trail, the sound stopped. I didn't look back. I just kept running until I reached my Jeep. I reported what I'd seen, but the investigation turned up nothing. No bones, no light, no tracks, nothing but my own. Officially, it was written off as an overactive imagination. Unofficially, I stopped working near Devil's Hollow. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. But every now and then, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that voice, crackling through the radio. "Turn. Back." If you're ever hiking in Big Rock National Park and you see a light in the woods, do yourself a favor. Ignore it. I've been a forest ranger in the Shoshone National Forest for 10 years now. Most days it's a peaceful job, checking trails, handling wildlife, making sure people don't get lost. But there are moments I can't shake, that remind you just how small and vulnerable we really are. This happened last fall, around mid-November. The weather had just started to turn cold, and the tourists were thinning out. A quiet, eerie kind of stillness took over the forest. I was alone, working the evening shift as usual, taking a routine patrol near an old logging trail. It's a part of the park that rarely gets any attention. Most of the forest rangers stay clear of it. It's not that it's dangerous. No, it's something else. It feels watched. It was about 7 p.m. when I noticed something off. I was making my way through the trail, my flashlight illuminating the path ahead, when I heard it. This low, dragging sound. At first I thought it might have been an animal, a deer maybe, dragging something through the underbrush. But then it stopped. That's when I noticed the air. The temperature dropped suddenly. You know, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones. It wasn't the kind of cold you get from a winter chill. It was unnatural, like the temperature was lowering just for you. I called out, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. "Hello? Is someone out there?" The only answer I got was the rustle of the trees, the wind picking up. My instincts were firing. It felt like I wasn't alone. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was nothing. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of red. At first, I thought it was a reflection. Maybe the light from my flashlight was catching something, but no. It wasn't a reflection. I looked again, and there it was. 2 small, blood-red eyes staring at me from between the trees. For a moment, I froze. The eyes didn't blink. They just stared, unwavering, locked onto me like they were seeing straight through me. "Who's there?" I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Nothing. I should have turned around then. I knew I should have, but something made me move closer. Maybe I thought it was a prank, some kid messing around. Maybe I was curious. Either way, I took a step toward those eyes. The moment I did, the eyes vanished. Not blinked, not moved. They just disappeared. I should have turned around. I should have left right then, but I didn't. My mind was racing. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. My feet kept moving, like they had a mind of their own, guiding me toward the spot where the eyes had been. I didn't even realize how deep into the forest I'd gone until I came across something that stopped me cold. There in the middle of the clearing was a figure. A tall figure draped in tattered clothes, standing completely still, facing the trees. Its back was hunched, and it looked like it was waiting for something, or someone. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. My flashlight was trembling in my hand, and for the first time in my career as a ranger, I felt fear. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. But then, slowly, it turned its head. And there they were, those red eyes again, glowing faintly in the darkness, locked onto me like a predator tracking its prey. I couldn't breathe. It was like time froze. The cold intensified, and my mind was screaming at me to run, to get away. But my legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished. Not a sound, not a movement. Gone. I snapped back to reality and started backing away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't take my eyes off the spot, afraid if I turned around I'd see it, whatever it was, coming for me. I didn't even stop to think. I just ran. I don't know how far I ran. Maybe a mile, maybe more. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest ranger station, gasping for breath, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. The next morning, I went back with a few other rangers, hoping to find some evidence of what I saw. Footprints, signs, anything. But there was nothing. No sign of the figure, no red eyes, no trace of whatever I'd stumbled across. They told me I was imagining things. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the isolation of the forest got to me. But I knew what I saw. I'll never forget those eyes, the way they stared at me, the cold that followed them. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since that night. I can't. Something about it is wrong, unnaturally wrong. Every time I close my eyes, I see those eyes, glowing in the darkness, waiting. And if you ever find yourself on the logging trail near the eastern edge of Shoshone National Forest, don't stop. Don't look. And whatever you do, don't wander too far off the path, because something is watching, and it doesn't want to be found. I've worked as a forest ranger for nearly 20 years now, and I've learned a lot about the woods, the land, and the creatures that inhabit it. Most of it is simple: trees, trails, and wildlife. But then there are the things you can't explain, the things that make your blood run cold when you think about them, but you'll never speak of aloud. This is one of those things, And it happened on a night just like any other, except it wasn't. It was the end of October, nearing the start of hunting season. The weather had already turned cold, and the sun had started setting earlier, casting long shadows across the trees. I was working the late shift in the Cascade Range, deep in Washington State's wilderness. A quiet, peaceful place, or so I thought. The shift had been uneventful. I'd checked the trails, made sure there were no illegal hunters, and was wrapping things up when I got a call on the radio. "Ranger Hayes, we got a report of some strange sounds near Pine Ridge. Some hikers say they've heard whispers. Could be nothing, but we need someone to check it out." I'd heard the rumors before. People come up with all sorts of wild stories when they're out in the woods at night. Strange noises, voices, things that aren't there. I figured it was just some folks spooked by the darkness. "Copy that," I replied, trying to sound professional. "I'll check it out." I headed towards Pine Ridge, an area that had always given me an odd feeling. The trees there were dense, twisted, and old, some of the tallest pines I'd ever seen. It was one of those places where the wind always seemed to howl louder than it should, like the forest was trying to speak. By the time I got there, the air was thick with fog, and the moon barely broke through the clouds. I parked my truck at the trailhead and grabbed my flashlight. The woods were completely still, too still. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I followed the trail into the trees, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. The silence weighed heavy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I moved deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. I zipped up my jacket, but it didn't help. My breath came out in puffs of white vapor, even though it wasn't cold enough to freeze the air. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it wasn't just the wind. No, this was a voice. A soft, urgent voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Turn back." I stopped in my tracks. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, nothing. Just the dark trees. I chalked it up to nerves. The fog was messing with my mind, I thought. So I pressed on, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. The deeper I went, the more the whispers grew. They were faint at first, like wind through the trees, but then they became clearer, louder, more insistent. "Turn back," I called out, my voice a little shaky. "Who's out there? Show yourself." But there was no answer. The whispers continued like a chant, always just out of reach. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught my eye. A figure darting between the trees, barely visible in the fog. I froze. Was it a person? I couldn't tell. It was gone too quickly, but I knew something was out there. "Hey, I'm a ranger. Are you lost?" I shouted, my voice louder now. The whispers stopped. A deep, unnatural silence settled over the forest. And then I heard it. A sound that chilled me to my core. A low, guttural growl, like an animal with too many teeth. It came from the shadows, from somewhere deeper in the woods. I spun around, my flashlight flicking across the trees, but I saw nothing. Nothing except the fog, the darkness, and the sense of being watched. I should have turned back. I know that now, but I didn't. I moved closer to where I had seen the figure. My steps slow, deliberate, my heart pounding in my chest. The growling stopped, but the whispers, they started again, louder this time, almost deafening. "Turn back, leave, now." I was shaking, but I kept going, pushing forward despite the terror creeping into my chest. I wasn't about to let fear control me. And then, right there in the middle of the clearing, I saw it, a shape. It was standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. At first, it looked like a shadow, but as I stepped closer, I could see its eyes, glowing red, like coals in a fire. I froze. The creature was tall, its features blurred, like a shadow that didn't belong. But those eyes, those glowing red eyes, were locked onto mine, unblinking, unyielding. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. Then the growling started again, closer now, right behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight dancing wildly. Nothing. When I turned back to the creature, it was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. But the whispers didn't stop. They were louder than ever, swirling in the air all around me. Leave, leave now. I couldn't run fast enough. My legs were moving before my brain even processed what was happening. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, slamming the door behind me, locking it. The next day, I went back to the spot with some backup. But when we reached the clearing, there was no sign of the creature. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was like the night before had never happened. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I will never go back to Pine Ridge again. So, if you ever find yourself out there in the Cascade Range and you hear the whispers on the wind, you should listen. They're not just the wind. And if you see those red eyes in the fog, turn around and run. I've been a forest ranger for 15 years now, working in the dense woods of Idaho, where the trees grow thick and the air smells of pine and earth. The quiet out here is different from anywhere else. It's not just peaceful, it's unnervingly silent. And on a few rare occasions, I've felt that silence swallow me whole. This is one of those times. It was late September and the air was starting to turn crisp. The tourists were dwindling, and I had the forest mostly to myself. It's a beautiful stretch of wilderness, but there are spots that feel off. Places where the trees seem to whisper to you in the wind. The kind of places you'd walk through in broad daylight, but something in the back of your mind would tell you to hurry up. I was on a late afternoon patrol, checking some of the older trails. One of them, an old logging route that no one really used anymore, had been on my list for weeks. I'd gotten reports about strange marks on the trees, but nothing serious. Still, it's my job to check everything out. So, I took a deep breath and headed off. The trail was overgrown. Bushes had swallowed parts of the path, and the trees were so close together that I could barely make out the sky. I was following some faded, almost non-existent markings on the trunks when I started hearing it. It wasn't the usual forest sounds. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant calls of animals, just a soft, low hum. At first, I thought it was my imagination. You spend enough time alone in the woods, and your mind starts playing tricks. But then it got louder. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It sounded like something breathing. I stopped in my tracks, squinting into the woods. The hum was coming from all around me, and the air felt heavier. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, watching me, waiting for something. I scanned the trees, the dark shadows between them, my flashlight flickering in the growing dusk. And then I saw it. A tree, older than any I'd seen in this part of the forest. It was hollow, completely empty in the center, as though something had carved it out long ago. But it wasn't the hollow that made my skin crawl. It was what was inside. There, deep in the heart of the tree, were what looked like markings. Not carvings, not scratches, but something else. Something that shifted when I looked directly at it. I moved closer, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The closer I got, the clearer the shapes became, patterns that looked almost like faces. Hundreds of them stacked one on top of the other, all contorted, their eyes wide open, their mouths stretched in silent screams. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I'd seen a lot in my years as a ranger, creatures, animals, strange things. But this wasn't normal. And then, the hum grew louder. But now, it wasn't just a hum. It was a voice, 1,000 voices, all whispering at once. Come closer, come closer, take it. I froze. The voice seemed to come from all directions, deep from within the trees, echoing off the trunks. And the faces inside the tree, they were moving. At first, it was just their eyes, blinking, twitching, following me. But then their mouths started to move. Their lips curled, whispering something I couldn't hear. I wanted to run. I should have run. But my legs wouldn't move. It was like the forest had rooted me to the spot, like I was stuck in the grip of something ancient, something far older than I could understand. And then from behind me, I heard it, the sound of something shifting in the underbrush. The hum, the voices, they stopped, and for a moment all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I turned slowly, my flashlight flicking across the ground. Nothing. The air was thick, like it was holding its breath. But that's when I saw it. Another tree, a few yards off the trail, its bark slick and black as though it had been burned. It was a twisted, knotted thing, taller than any of the others around it. But it wasn't the tree that caught my attention. It was what was in the shadows beneath it. A figure. It was standing there, facing the tree, hunched over as though it were listening. It wore a cloak of tattered black fabric, and its face was hidden in shadow. I could feel its eyes on me even though I couldn't see them. It didn't move. It just stood there unmoving, like it was waiting. I called out, but my voice came out weak, strangled. "Hey, what are you doing here?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even acknowledge me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run. I turned back to the hollow tree, the faces still staring at me, now more vivid, more desperate, as if they wanted something from me, something I couldn't understand. I had to get out of there. I stumbled back along the trail, my breath ragged, the sound of the hum and whispers still echoing in my head. I don't remember much after that. Just running until I finally broke through the trees and back onto the main road. I didn't stop until I was in my truck, the engine roaring to life, the headlights sweeping over the dark woods behind me. The next morning, I went back. I wasn't going to let whatever it was out there scare me off. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing. No hollow tree, no figure in the shadows, no eerie hum. Just trees. Quiet, still, empty trees. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I won't ever go back to that part of the woods again. If you ever find yourself in the northern part of Idaho, near the old logging routes, avoid the hollow trees, because there's something in them, something that's been waiting, watching for a long time. And if you listen long enough, you might hear the whispers too. I've been a forest ranger for 12 years, mostly in the wild stretches of Oregon's coast, where the air is thick with fog and the trees seem like ancient sentinels watching over the land. People think being a ranger is a peaceful job, just walking through the woods, taking care of nature. But you spend enough time in those forests, and you start to realize there's something more out there, something that isn't quite natural. It was late October when it happened. The air had already turned that crisp, biting cold, and the sun barely made it through the thick canopy of pines. I'd just finished checking a trail and was heading back to my truck when I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing in the distance between two massive pine trees. At first, I thought it was just another hiker who'd gotten lost. It wasn't uncommon, especially with the fog rolling in thick that day. But this wasn't right. I called out, "Hey, you lost?" No response. I figured they couldn't hear me, so I started walking toward them. As I got closer, I saw that the figure wasn't moving. It was standing perfectly still, facing the trees, just watching them, its hands hanging loosely at its sides. I stopped a few feet away and called again, a little louder this time. "You okay?" Still nothing. I took a step forward, then another. My boots crunched in the fallen leaves. The figure didn't flinch, didn't turn. It was tall, way taller than a normal person should be. But I couldn't make out any features, not even the shape of its head. The air around it felt different, thicker somehow, like something was pressing in. The fog made it hard to see clearly, but I could tell there was something off about this person, something unnatural. That's when I felt it. A chill that ran down my spine, like someone was watching me from behind. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. Just the heavy silence of the forest. "Hello?" I asked, taking another step closer to the figure. I was about 10 feet away now, close enough to see that the figure wasn't wearing anything that looked like normal clothes. It was more like a shadow, a dark outline against the pines, shifting slightly like it wasn't entirely there. "Hey!" I shouted. My heart was starting to race. "Are you all right?" That's when it turned. Slowly, painfully slow, like something dragging its joints against the weight of the world. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, empty, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me into something deeper. I froze. My chest felt tight, like the air had turned to lead. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows that danced around the trees. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, deep and gravelly, like it was coming from the earth itself. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My fingers were numb, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my radio. "Ranger Evans, calling in," I whispered hoarsely into the radio. "I need backup, now." But when I turned back, the figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished into the mist. I spent the next hour searching the area, convinced I was going crazy. There was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Just the thick fog and the heavy silence. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching me. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure's empty face, and I could still hear that voice, low and raspy, echoing in my head. "You shouldn't be here." A week later, I went back to the same spot. The fog had cleared, but the trees were still as dense as ever. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that maybe I was just overtired or stressed. But as soon as I stepped into that stretch of forest, I felt it again. The same oppressive silence. The same wrongness. I walked the trail carefully, my hand brushing the rough bark of the pines. I reached the spot where I'd seen the figure, and the ground beneath my boots felt cold, unnaturally cold. Then I saw it. At the base of a giant pine, a small wooden box had been left behind. It wasn't here before. I knew that much. The box was covered in symbols, old, faded, and carved deep into the wood. Symbols I didn't recognize, but they looked almost familiar, like they were from a language that had been lost to time. I reached down, my fingers brushing the surface. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, the trees pressing in tighter. There was a creak, a groan, like the forest was alive and breathing with me. And then the voice again, this time much closer, right behind me. "You shouldn't have touched it." I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the fog thickening once again, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I ran like I'd never run before, tearing through the woods, not caring about the trail, not caring about anything but getting the hell out of there. I don't know what I touched that day, but I know it wasn't just a box. When I got back to the station, I tried to tell my supervisor what happened, but the words caught in my throat. No one believes you when you tell them about something like this. They don't understand. I've been back to that spot since, but the box is gone, and the figure, it hasn't shown itself again. But every time I walk those woods, I feel it watching me. And I know one thing for sure, it's not done with me yet. If you ever find yourself out in the forests of Oregon and you come across a spot that feels wrong, just turn around. Walk away, because there are things out there in the pines, things you can't see, but they can see you. And once you've seen them, you'll never be the same again.